Music rationalizes sound, but a more momentous rationalizing of sound is seen in language. Language is one of the most useful of things, yet the greater part of it still remains, what it must all have been in the beginning. Useless, and without ulterior significance. The musical side of language is its primary and elementary side. Man is endowed with vocal organs so plastic as to emit a great variety of delicately varied sounds. And by good fortune, his ear has a parallel sensibility, so that much vocal expression can be registered and confronted by auditory feeling. It has been said that man's preeminence in nature is due to his possessing hands. His modest participation in the ideal world may similarly be due to his possessing tongue and ear. For when he finds shouting and vague moaning after a while fatiguing, he can draw new pleasure from uttering all sorts of labial, dental, and guttural sounds. The rhythms and oppositions can entertain him, and he can begin to use his lingual gamut to designate the whole range of his perceptions and passions. Merely to have added a vocal designation to fleeting things would in itself have encumbered phenomena without rendering them in any way more docile to the will. But the encumbrance in this instance proved to be a wonderful preservative, a means of comparison. It actually gave each moving thing its niche and cenotaph in the eternal. For the universe of vocal sounds was a field, like that of color or number, in which the elements showed relations and transitions easy to dominate. It was a keyboard over which attention could run back and forth, eliciting many implicit harmonies. Henceforth, when various sounds have been idly associated with various things, and identified with them, the things could, by virtue of their names, be carried over mentally into the linguistic system. They could be manipulated there ideally, and vicariously preserved in representation. Needless to say that the things themselves remained unchanged all the while in their efficacy and mechanical succession, just as they remain unchanged in those respects when they pass for the mathematical observer into their measure or symbol. But as this reduction to mathematical form makes them calculable, so their earlier reduction to words rendered them comparable and memorable, first enabling them to figure in discourse at all. Language had originally no obligation to subserve an end which we may sometimes measure it by now and depute to be its proper function, namely, to stand for things and adapt itself perfectly to their structure. The vocal and musical medium is, and must always remain, alien to the spatial. Yet when sounds were attached to an event or emotion, the net of vocal relations caught the natural object as a cobweb might catch a fly, without destroying or changing it. The object's quality passed to the word at the same time that the word's relations enveloped the object, and thus a new weight and significance was added to sound, previously nothing but a dull music. A conflict at once established itself between the drift proper to the verbal medium and that proper to designated things, a conflict which the whole history of language and thought has exemplified, and which continues to this day. Suppose an animal going down to a frozen river, which he had previously visited in summer. Marks of all sorts would awaken in him an old train of reactions. He would doubtless feel premonitions of satisfied thirst and the splash of water. On finding, however, instead of the fancied liquid, a mass of something like cold stone, he would be disconcerted. His active attitude would be pulled up short and contradicted. In his fairyland of faith and magic, the old river would have been simply annihilated. The dreamt of water would have become a vanished ghost, and this ice, for the moment, a hard reality. He would turn away and live for a while on other illusions. When the shock was overgrown by time, and it was summer again, the original habit might, however, reassert itself once more. If you revisited the stream, some god would seem to bring temporary estrangement. The cloud that for a while had made the good invisible would soon be gone and forgotten. If we imagine, on the contrary, that this animal could speak and had from the first called his haunt the river, he would have repeated its name on seeing it, even when it was frozen, for he had not failed to recognize it in that guise. The variation afterwards noticed, upon finding it hard, would seem no total substitution, but a change, for it would be the same river once flowing, that was now congealed. An identical word covering all the identical qualities in the phenomena and serving to abstract them, would force the inconsistent qualities in those phenomena to pass for accidents, and the useful proposition could at once be framed that the same river may be sometimes free and sometimes frozen. This proposition is true, yet it contains much that is calculated to offend a scrupulous dialectician. Its language and categories are not purely logical, but largely physical and representative. The motion that what changes nevertheless endures is a remarkable hybrid. It arises when rigid ideal terms are imposed on evanescent existence. Feelings taken alone would show no identities. They would be lost in changing, or be woven into the infinite feeling of change. Notions, taken alone, would allow no lapse, but would merely lead attention about from point to point over an eternal mosaic. Power to understand the world, logical or scientific mastery of existence, arises only by the forced and conventional marriage of these two essences. When the actual flux is ideally suspended and an ideal harness is loosely flung upon things. For this purpose, words are an admirable instrument. They have dialectical relations based on ideal import or tendency to definition, which makes their essence their signification. Yet they can be freely bandied about and applied for a moment to the ambiguous things that pass through existence. What words add is not power of discernment or action, but a medium of intellectual exchange. Language is like money, without which specific relative values may well exist and be felt, but cannot be reduced to a common denominator. And as money should have a certain intrinsic value of its own, in order that its relation to other values may be stable, so a word, by which a thing is represented in discourse, must be a part of that thing's contact with mankind. Words in their existence are no more universal than gold by nature is a standard of value in other things. Words are a material accompaniment of phenomena, at first an idle accompaniment, but one which happens to subserve easily a universal function. Words, just by virtue of their adventitious, detachable status, and because they are so easily compared and manipulated in the world of sound, were singularly well fitted for this office. They are not vague, as any common quality abstracted from things would necessarily become. It is one thing to perceive an ill-determined form, and quite another to attribute to it a precise general predicate. Words distinct in their own category and perfectly recognizable can accordingly perform very well the function of a universal, for they can be identified in turn with many particulars, and yet remain throughout particular themselves. The psychology of nominalism is undoubtedly right where it insists that every image is particular, and every term, in its existential aspect, a flatum vocis. But nominalists should have recognized that images may have any degree of vagueness and generality when measured by a conceptual standard. A figure having obviously three sides and three corners may very well be present to the mind, when it is impossible to say whether it is equilateral or a rectangular triangle. Functional or logical universality lies in another sphere altogether, being a matter of intent and not of existence. When we say that universals alone exist in the mind, we mean by mind something unrecognized by Berkeley, not a bundle of psychoses nor an angelic substance, but quick intelligence, the faculty of discourse. Predication is an act, understanding a spiritual and transitive operation. Its existential basis may well be counted in psychologically and reduced to a stream of immediate presences, but its meaning can be caught only by another meaning, as life only can exemplify life. Vague or general images are as little universal as sounds are, but a precise sound, better than a flickering abstraction, can serve the intellect in its operation of comparison and synthesis. Words are therefore the body of discourse, of which the soul is understanding. The categories of discourse are in part merely representative, in part merely grammatical, and in part attributable to both spheres. Euphony and phonetic laws are principles governing language without any reference to its meaning. Here speech is still a sort of music. At the other extreme lies the ultimate form of prose, which we see in mathematical reasoning or in telegraphic style, where absolutely nothing is rhetorical, and speech is denuded of every feature not indispensable to its symbolic role. Between these two extremes lies the broad field of poetry, or rather of imaginative or playful expression, where the verbal medium is a medium indeed, having a certain transparency, a certain reference to independent facts, but at the same time elaborates the fact in expressing it, and endows it with affinities alien to its proper nature. A pun is a grotesque example of such disruption, where ambiguities belonging only to speech are used to suggest impossible substitutions in ideas. Less frankly, language habitually wrests its subject matter in some measure from its real context and transfers it to a represented and secondary world, the world of logic and reflection. Concretions in existence are subsumed when named under concretions in discourse. Grammar lays violent hands upon experience, and everything becomes a prey to wit and fancy, a material for fiction and eloquence. Man's intellectual progress has a poetic phase, in which he imagines the world, and then a scientific phase, in which he sifts and tests what he has imagined. In what measure do inflection and syntax represent anything in the subject matter of discourse? In what measure are they an independent play of expression, a quasi-musical, quasi-mathematical veil interposed between reflection and existence? One who knows only languages of a single family can give but a biased answer to this question. There are doubtless many approaches to correct symbolism in languages, which grammar may have followed up at different times in strangely different ways. That the medium in every art has a character of its own, a character limiting its representative value, may perhaps be safely asserted, and this intrinsic character in the medium antedates and permeates all representation. Phonetic possibilities and phonetic habits belong, in language, to this indispensable vehicle. What the throat and lips can emit easily and distinguishably, and what sequences can appeal to the ear and be retained, depend alike on physiological conditions, and no matter how convenient or inconvenient these conditions may be for signification, they will always make themselves felt and may sometimes remain predominant. In poetry they are still conspicuous. Euphony, meter, and rhyme color the images they transmit and add a charm wholly extrinsic and imputed. In this immersion of the message in the medium and its intrinsic movement, the magic of poetry lies. The miracle grows as there is more or less native analogy between the medium's movement and that of the subject matter. The structure of language, when it passes beyond the phonetic level, begins at once to lean upon existences and to imitate the structure of things. We distinguish the parts of speech, for instance, in subservience to distinctions which we make in objects, the feeling or quality represented by an adjective, the relation indicated by a verb, the substance or concretion of qualities designated by a noun, the diversities growing up in an experience by no means attributable to the mere play of sound. The parts of speech are therefore representative. Their inflection is representative too, since tenses mark important practical differences in the distribution of the events described, and cases express respective roles played by objects in the operation. I struck him, and he will strike me, renders in linguistic symbols a marked change that may occur. The variation in phrase is not rhetorical. Language here, though borrowed, no doubt, from ancestral poetry, has left all reverie far behind and has been submerged in the life of reason. The medium, however, constantly reasserts itself. An example may be found in gender, which clearly representative in a measure, cuts loose in language from all genuine representation and becomes a feature in abstract linguistic design, a formal characteristic with its own sex and with the other. Nouns and adjectives represent this contrast by taking on masculine and feminine forms. The distinction is indeed so important that wholly different words, duck and drake, bull and cow, stand for the best known animals of different sex, while adjectives, where declension is extinct, as in English, often take on a connotation of gender and are applied to one sex only, as we say a beautiful woman, but a handsome man. But gender in language extends much farther than sex, and even if by some subtle analogy all the masculine and feminine nouns in a language could be attached to something suggesting sex in the objects they designate, yet it can hardly be maintained that the elaborate concordance incident upon the distinction is representative of any felt quality in the things. So remote an analogy to sex could not assert itself pervasively. Thus where it says, Quis monta gracilis te puera in rosa perfusis equitis regat adorabus grado pura sabandro. Here we may perceive why the rose was instinctively made feminine, and we may grant that the bower, though the reason escape us, was somehow properly masculine, but no one would urge that a profusion of roses was also intrinsically feminine, or that the pleasantness of a bower was ever specifically masculine to sense. The epithets multa and grado take their gender from nouns, even though the quality they designate fails to do so. Artificial concordance in gender does not express gender, it merely emphasizes the grammatical links in the phrases and makes greater variety possible in the arrangement of words. This example may prepare us to understand a general principle, that language, while essentially significant viewed in its function, is indefinitely wasteful, being automatic and tentative in its origin. It overloads itself, and being primarily music and a labyrinth of sounds, it develops an articulation and method of its own, which only in the end, and with much inexactness, reverts to its function of designation. How great the possibilities of effect are in developing a pure medium, we can best appreciate in music. But rhetoric and utility keep language going, as centrifugal and centripetal forces keep a planet in its course. Euphony, verbal analogy, grammatical fancy, poetic confusion continually drive language afield in its own tangential direction, while the business of life in which language is employed and the natural lapse of rhetorical fashions has continually drawn it back towards convenience and exactitude. Until music is subordinated, speech has a little sense. Yet if music were left behind altogether, language would pass into a sort of algebra or vocal shorthand without literary quality. It would become wholly indicative and record facts without coloring them ideally. This medium and its intrinsic development, though they make the bane of science, make the essence of art. They give representation a new and specific value, such as the object before representation could not have possessed. Consciousness itself is such a medium in respect to diffuse existence, which it foreshortens and elevates into synthetic ideas. Reason, too, by bringing the movement of events and inclinations to a head in single acts of reflection, thus attaining to laws and purposes, introduces into life the influence of a representative medium, without which life could never pass from a process into an art. Language acquires scope the same way, by its kindly infidelities. Its metaphors and syntax blend experience perspective. Language vitiates the experience it expresses, but thereby makes the burden of one moment relevant to that of another. The two experiences, identified roughly with the same concretion in discourse, are pronounced similar or comparable in character. Thus a proverb, by its verbal pungency and rhythm, becomes more memorable than the event it first described would ever have been if not translated into an epigram and rendered, so to speak, applicable to new cases. For by that translation, the event has become an idea. To turn events into ideas is the function of literature. Music, which in a certain sense is a mass of pure forms, must leave its ideas embedded in their own medium. They are musical ideas, and cannot impose them on any foreign material, such as human affairs. Science, on the contrary, seeks to disclose the bleak anatomy of existence, stripping off, as much as possible, the veil of prejudice and words. Literature takes a middle course and tries to subdue music, which for its purposes would be futile and too abstract, into conformity with general experience, making music thereby significant. Literary art in the end rejects all unmeaning flourishes, all complications that have no counterpart in things or no use in expressing their relations. At the same time, it aspires to digest that reality to which it confines itself, making it over into ideal substance and material for the mind. It looks at things with an incorrigibly dramatic eye, turning them into permanent unities, which they never are, and almost into persons, grouping them by their imaginative or moral affinities, and retaining in them chiefly what is incidental to their being, namely, the part they may chance to play in man's adventures. Such literary art demands a subject matter other than the literary impulse itself. The literary man is an interpreter and hardly succeeds, as a musician may, without experience and mastery of human affairs. His art is half genius and half fidelity. He needs inspiration. He must wait for automatic musical tendencies to ferment in his mind, proving it to be fertile in devices, comparisons, and both assimilations. Yet inspiration alone will lead him astray, for his art is relative to something other than its own formal impulse. It comes to clarify the real world, not to encumber it, and it needs to render its native agility practical, and to attach its volume of feeling to what is momentous in human life. Literature has its piety, its conscience. It cannot long forget, without forfeiting all dignity, that it serves a burdened and perplexed creature, a human animal struggling to persuade the universal sphinx to propose a more intelligible riddle. Irresponsible and trivial in its abstract impulse, man's simian chatter becomes noble as it becomes symbolic. Its representative function lends it a serious beauty. This utility endows it with moral worth.